Okay, once again, if we could have your attention, we are going to begin our lunch session, plenary session on UNDRIP and modern treaties. Just ask the facility if we could have the back doors closed and have everybody's attention. I'll invite the panelists to come up and join us. As I'm sure many of you know, in 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In 2016, Canada stated that they would embrace UNDRIP without reservation. Province of British Columbia enacted enabling legislation, implementation legislation in 2019. Canada's Parliament enacted implementation legislation in 2021, and the Northwest Territories government enacted enabling legislation in 2023. It is an international instrument that has, at least in my practice, in my experience, been the focus of government since 2019 in British Columbia, and has attracted a lot of attention. And the role that UNDRIP plays in the context of modern treaties has raised a number of questions that we are going to explore today. Our panel today includes Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, who is the North American member of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have Gary Yabsley online, my colleague, senior counsel from Ratcliffe LLP. Gary is my mentor, my colleague, my friend. Gary has a very full career that spans decades, including being involved in the creation of Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. So very well, a long career of supporting Indigenous people in their journey for reconciliation in this country. Our third panelist is Chief Counselor John Jack of Huu-ay-aht First Nations, Huu-ay-aht being one of the members of the Manaus First Nations whose final agreement came into effect in 2011. I'll ask each of the panelists to provide a little more of their own bio when they speak. And we will begin with Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. It's really an honor and a privilege to join this group in this particular conversation today. And as Brett noted, I am currently serving as the North American member of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'll touch upon that body just a bit during my comments, but briefly, it is a subsidiary body of the UN Human Rights Council, and it is mandated to help interpret and support the implementation of the UN Declaration within member states, helping Indigenous peoples and other international and non-governmental organizations. So I'm an Anishinaabe. I come from the southern shore of Lake Superior, and my home community is at Lawns, Michigan, Kewanna Bay. In your bios, you will see that I'm listed as a professor of Indigenous politics at the University of British Columbia. Last minute change, as of January 1st, I'm transitioning to the University of Toronto. So I had a shorter flight coming instead of from Vancouver. Yesterday, I came in on the very quick hop from Toronto. So I am in political science, focusing on global Indigenous politics as a very tight field, and also at the Monk School of Public Policy, where I hope to bring a lot more Indigenous content into that Global Affairs School. So again, very pleased to be with you. And I want to, in my opening comments, I was asked to speak a bit about the development and implementation of the UN Declaration at the international level, and also provide a few reflections on Article 37 in the Declaration, how it's there, why we have it, and what it can do for us. So there are three key points that I want to bring to the conversation this afternoon. And I want to elaborate a bit on each of these three in the few minutes that I have with you. So first of all, I want to cover in a historical way the fact that treaties, however they are constructed, were fundamental to the very development of the UN Declaration itself. Secondly, I want to spend a little time discussing how the United Nations has given over the years and continues to give on a regular basis significant attention to the issue of treaty. And then thirdly, just a few thoughts on how modern treaties in particular and the UN Declaration are mutually enforcing. So first point, treaties as foundational to the UN Declaration. So a little bit of historical background, and I have written hundreds and hundreds of pages about the historical background, so we'll just give you a really quick 2-minute history of this issue. And just note that Indigenous peoples, primarily from North America, have insisted that treaties are binding international agreements and not just historical artifacts for decades. And then since the 1970s, when the global Indigenous movement really had its first moves in the international level, Indigenous leaders from all over the world have mobilized to demand the international recognition and enforcement of their treaties. So if we go back to the 1970s, there are a few key highlight moments that laid the groundwork for the UN Declaration, and actually were some of the first impulses that led to an international mechanism at all. So first of all, 1974, there was a call to action, a very strong call to action that came out of the first international treaty conference held at Standing Rock, South Dakota. And for those of us who are familiar with the battles over pipelines, Standing Rock is and has been a source of activism for generations. So the Indigenous leaders and elders and youth and friends that gathered at Standing Rock did so to affirm the nation-to-nation status of treaties and also to raise awareness and condemn the high level of treaty violations that they have experienced over so many years. And that conference, 1974, called on the United Nations to pay attention to treaty violations and marked the start of what has become global Indigenous diplomacy. Also in 1974, just a few months after, there was the very first meeting of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples at Port Alberni, BC. And at this meeting, this was the first global Indigenous political organizational meeting. And at this meeting, treaties were declared that they must be considered as binding international agreements and began setting the stage for treaty conversation in what would eventually, after many, many more years, 30 more years, set the stage for the UN Declaration text. Now that work actually began globally in 1977 at the first Indigenous conference held in the UN at Geneva. And this brought the issue of treaties directly to the United Nations. That meeting was organized by the International Indian Treaty Council, and this was the first gathering of Indigenous peoples at the United Nations. The number one concern raised at that 1977 meeting was treaties, and they were presented as human rights violations. And they began to engage at that point with the various UN human rights mechanisms. This resulted, this 77 meeting, in a number of indigenous organizations gaining UN's NGO status at the United Nations and began a permanent presence in global discussions. So these three key 1977 initial conversations directly influenced the drafting of the UN Declaration, which happened during the 1980s and the early 1990s. And this was the very first time in UN history that the rights holders themselves, the indigenous peoples, were at the table with the United Nations and other international actors drafting their own human rights declaration. And so Article 37 comes out of all of these conversations, as treaties were a primary influence in all of those early conversations and led to Article 37 that affirms indigenous treaty rights. So what has the UN done about treaties in the time since? Well, one thing that we should all be prepared to look at and refer to repeatedly in our own work is an extremely comprehensive 9-year study on treaties in the United Nations by Professor Miguel Alfonso Martinez. And he had a report tabled in 1999 that emphasized that all treaties, all indigenous peoples' treaties, must be recognized under international law. And a key recommendation of his was to hold further discussions in 3 UN expert seminars to explore treaty enforcement strategies. And those were held in 2003, 2006, and in 2012. And if we look at all 3 of those treaty seminars together, there are some key conclusions that we can take away. And again, the reports are voluminous, so we can take a couple key points away. Is that the seminars as a whole reaffirmed that treaties, whether historic, numbered, or modern, are legally binding, and states are obligated to honor and enforce them. And the UN Declaration's preambular paragraphs 14, 15, and 24 stress the importance of mutual consent and good faith in treaty relations. These treaty seminars, secondly, emphasized that free, prior, and informed consent, or what we now call FPIC, is an absolute minimum standard for all treaty negotiations. Because FPIC is tied to self-determination, it must apply in negotiation of new treaties. It must apply in the implementation of existing treaty agreements. And thirdly, it must apply in any dispute resolution mechanism. Thirdly, the treaty seminars also concluded that there must be benefit sharing. Good faith consultations must ensure that indigenous nations retain control over their lands, resources, and cultural heritage. And further, that states must implement participatory mechanisms for indigenous oversight. Much more recently, just last month in fact, there was a 4th international seminar on treaties that was held in Edmonton and hosted by Treaty 6. And this is picking up the conversation from the 3 earlier treaties and advancing it a bit further. This seminar reaffirmed that treaties are not land cessions, but are actually agreements of coexistence that have a personality under international law. The indigenous leaders at this seminar took extra time to discuss the need for stronger UN and international monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. Some key resolutions to come out of that seminar. They would like a renewed UN study focused specifically on what happens when there are disputes or violations of treaties. And a formal request was made for a new UN investigation into Canada's compliance with all treaty rights. Second resolution was calls for Indigenous participation in international treaty law discussions. And thirdly, and this is probably one of the biggest gaps still left from the COBO treaty study from many years ago, is the seminar has pushed for further treaty enforcement outside of state control and taking it to international legal bodies. Now, the UN body that I serve on, the UNDRIP, has also played a role in discussing and studying treaties. And again, the UNDRIP is part of the United Nations under the Human Rights Council that is intended to provide expertise and technical support to states and indigenous peoples in order to implement the UN Declaration. And in 2022, just a couple of years ago, we released a study focused on treaties. And it has a long name. It's actually Treaties, Agreements, and Other Constructive Arrangements. And we emphasized in that study the need for justice, democracy, and indigenous self-determination in treaty enforcement. We focused specifically on Article 37 and affirmed that it must be read in conjunction with all of the other rights in the Declaration, including and especially self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, and of course the rights to land, territories, and resources. Now, one thing we noted about Article 37, which is important to remember, is that even though the impetus and the discussion on the inclusion of treaties in the UN Declaration came from North American indigenous peoples, Article 37 was drafted in a way that it's flexible enough for the entire world. So we then have to bring it back to our local national context and read it in that regard. So essentially, Article 37 has to be read from bottom up and top down simultaneously. A few items that we noted in our study that are not completed, going back to the original COBO Treaty study. We still, to this day, have no international treaty registry. No one is keeping track of what indigenous treaties there are in the world in any sort of comprehensive way. And I know we have the technology to do this, so it's just a matter of political will. And we are noting that this is an uncompleted task. The other major task that was called for in all of those early treaty works, going back to the 1970s, is an international dispute mechanism. In other words, sovereigns don't like to go to the courts of another sovereign in order to resolve disputes. When we have a dispute internationally, we either negotiate or we come up with an independent mechanism. So that mechanism still does not exist. So these are things that we can continue to work on. Now, how are modern treaties and the UN Declaration mutually reinforcing? Modern treaties, of course, are constitutionally protected under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. Meanwhile, the UN Declaration is not a treaty. It's an international human rights instrument. It's a declaration. And that provides a guiding framework for interpreting Indigenous rights around the world, including under modern treaties. Now, also in Canada, for the last few years, we have had the UN Declaration Act, what was originally Bill C-15. And this now requires federal laws, including modern treaty agreements, to align with the principles of the UN Declaration. It also helps courts begin to interpret modern treaties in a way that is consistent with the UN Declaration, ensuring that conflicts are resolved in favor of Indigenous self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. And the UN Declaration rights are now derived from customary international law, meaning that they should also influence how modern treaties are implemented and enforced. So at the end of the day, whether you're in negotiations or whether you're in a courtroom, treaty and customary international law must be read together and ensure that they do not contradict broader international human rights. So I'd just like to close this part of the conversation by saying that at the end of the day, if we look at all of this international work on treaty, We can see that all treaties, whether they are historic, modern, or somewhere in between, are living agreements that continue to define Indigenous rights today. And Article 37 provides us an international legal foundation for enforcement, although much more work is needed to hold states accountable to all of those principles. And moving forward, it's essential that Indigenous nations remain active participants in shaping global governance and ensuring that sovereignty, legal tradition, and treaty rights are upheld at the global level as well as nationally and more locally. So thank you, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Lightfoot. And with that international context in hand, let's turn to Gary and talk about the Canadian context.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, John. As Brent said, my name is Gary Yabsley. I'm a lawyer in Vancouver and Victoria. When Brent asked me to participate in this, he indicated that, in fact, there was originally this slot was to be filled by a federal cabinet minister, as I understood it. I can only imagine your disappointment at me being a replacement. So be it. I'll do the best I can. Brent indicated to me the focus of this conversation would be to try and make some connections between UNDRIP and the Canadian Constitution itself, and specifically Section 35. They are elements out of two separate bodies of law, international and domestic. The more I thought about it, I put my mind to what the connecting factors are between Section 35, the Canadian Constitution, and UNDRIP. And one of those factors, one of the things that they have in common, as best I can understand, is they are instruments to address a colonial legacy internationally and domestically with the purpose of facilitating decolonization. Now, that's a whole lot to say, and it's vague in general in many ways. So we need to talk a little bit, I think, about the terminology we're using, and specifically the terms of colonialism and decolonization, because my experience has been they're used freely and often without any precision. So in trying to put my own mind to what it is I thought we were talking about, one of the ways I try to analyze things is to put it in a bit of a historical context. So let's take a look at the word colonialism from that historical context. And as best I understand it, colonialism is a product of a great many situations historically. And invariably, colonial relationships spring from imperial situations. So there have been in human history numerous empires, various Chinese empires, the Roman Empire, Incas and Aztecs had empires, all of which produced colonial relationships within that imperial sphere. So colonialism is not unique to one situation. The one that's most relevant to this conversation, I think, is probably the colonialism that emanated from various European empires over the past 400 years. And we're all familiar with, in our own situation, the British Empire, but numerous other competing European states had empires on a global scale. That age of European imperialism basically came crashing down with World War I. It was an imperialism based on monarchies around Europe. Their hubris in those monarchies led to a great extent to World War I, to the end of that global order. What followed then was about another 30 years of initiatives to reconstitute a global order, led by the Soviet Union, by Nazi Germany, and that came to an abject failure by 1946. So we're then left by 1946 with the remnants of a world order that no longer worked. And I believe from 46 until this day, what we've been engaged in globally is an effort to establish a global world order. And one of the components of this world order from 1946 on has been a commitment by the nation states that constituted this world order to decolonization. So there was, with the demise of the European empires, there was a realization that colonialism could not work. So decolonization became one of the characteristics of this modern world order. Now, that proposition, as it turns out, has, I believe, probably two dimensions. One is that there are the colonial relationships that are being decolonized were between nation states. So the Britain and its former colonies in Africa and other places began the process of severing those colonial ties. And the second was that within nation states, colonial relationships continued to exist. And so if you're going to decolonize, you have to address both of them. And so for the purposes of international law, there are numerous, numerous instruments proclaiming decolonization. So the economic, social, and cultural and civil rights covenants in the late 1940s, the Declaration of Independence of Colonial Countries and Peoples, are international law proclamations that the world was going to be decolonized. That was subsequently followed in 2007 by UNDRIP, by the acknowledgement by the international community that internal domestic colonial relationships needed to be terminated as well. So the aspirations at the international level in this new world order were that the world would no longer function on colonial relations. Now, within Canada, however, that same proposition is being addressed in two types of legal instruments. So one of those, the characteristics of one of those legal instruments is aspirational. So Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 is in and of itself an aspirational statement. It tells us what we want to do. It doesn't tell us how we do it. The second type of legal instrument, however, in Canadian domestic law is not aspirational, it's transactional. And just for a second, if we are actually going to talk about decolonizing a relationship, by definition, that decolonization process has to be transactional. Otherwise, you are repeating the very colonial relationship that you're purporting to take apart. And in terms of the aspirational legal instruments, I would suggest that the UN covenants are by necessity aspirational. Similarly, within Canadian domestic law, Section 35, as I said, is aspirational. Federal and provincial laws adopting UNDRIP are aspirational. They are statements of commitment to principle and objectives. However, those do not get us to a decolonized world. There is a need for a second set of legal instruments that are transactional. And as I say, my belief is that in the case of decolonization, you have to have transactional relationships in order to actually be decolonizing. So within the nation state of Canada, there are certain requirements in these transactional documents that need to be used as a standard against which success is being measured. These instruments must be the product of dialogue and negotiations. They must have the domestic law force and effect and comply with the rule of law. They must be precise as to the rights of all parties. They must allow courts and independent arbiters the ability to impose remedies in the events of disputes. They must be understood as an ongoing process. These are not land sales, the way some historic treaties have been couched, nor are they instruments that freeze the parties in time. As Dr. Lightfoot said, these are living instruments because the relationship is living and the decolonization process is ongoing. So they must be part of a living process. And they must address all elements of the colonial relationship. And I'm glad John Jack's here because John's living that that process. What do I mean? Well, they must address the legal aspects of a colonial relationship. They must address the economic basis upon which colonialism was perpetrated. They must address the cultural implications of a colonial relationship. They must address the historic reality of it. That is the pain that has been caused by that colonial relationship. Residential schools is the prime example. And they must be institutional. They must be built into constitutional relationships in which the institutions of the decolonized world are fully functional, empowered, and economically capable of exercising the jurisdictions that are inherently theirs. So, and then when I turn my mind to where we are compared to where we were in 1982, certain realities come to the fore for me. So there is no single instrument for decolonization. There is no single instrument by which reconciliation takes place. There are a range of instruments that we in Canada, probably more so than any other country in the world, are now coming to realize have value and merit. There's no single way to do this. It could be modern treaties. It could be reconciliation agreements. It could be mutual benefits agreements with private third parties. It could be co-management arrangements. It could be business partnerships. It could be redefined government relations, including relations between First Nations and municipal governments. It could be various revenue sharing arrangements in which First Nations are made legitimate beneficiaries of the wealth of their traditional territories. And it could be wrapped into both federal and provincial acknowledgement of Aboriginal rights as a starting point. So the long and the short of it then is there are numerous, if this is a process of decolonization, there has to be both aspirational and transactional legal instruments that can be used to accomplish it, and there are a range and a variety of instruments that are doing it. And are anybody concerned about not having reached nirvana yet? It's going to be a long process. It's taken generations to build some of these dysfunctional structures. It's going to take generations to redesign them to fit First Nations objectives and empowerment. So that's all I got to say.
Thanks, Gary. We're going to take it from 30,000 feet down to ground level. Chief John Jack, Chief Counselor of Huu-ay-aht First Nations, over to you for UNDRIP on the ground.
Thanks. Testing, testing. There we go. Thank you, Brent. We may be gliding around the airport for a bit. I'd like to stay a little high level to start, just because of everything that's already been said. My name is John Jack. My traditional name is Sayachat. I'm the elected Chief Counselor for the Huu-ay-aht First Nations. We're a party to the Monmouth Final Agreement, and we've been self-governing since April of 2011. That's not the whole story. At least personally, I am dual heritage and I'm intercultural. And as a result of that, I must say that I grew up away from home, and I grew up outside of my Indigenous heritage. And it's been quite a journey since I got involved with the nation, probably about 2006, 2007. And whenever I think about these things in regards to how power works, I think power is the underlying consideration in almost everything we do. Not just at an international level, but definitely at an international level. All you need to do is look at how the United States or Russia or China or other countries are acting. Power matters, especially when people feel threatened. Especially when people feel threatened. Imagine the types of things that you would do to protect your own family, the advantages that you would create and maintain in order to secure your future. Why wouldn't you do it? Why wouldn't you put your thumb on the scale in order to make sure that your children and your children's children and your children's children's children have the chance at a secure future? Now think about that writ large. Think about all of the people who put their thumbs on the scales over history forever. And now think about the people who started to impose a different order on top of that naked application of power. That we have an international order that has been crawling forward since 1648. That we have the concept of the nation that has been helped to be created since, and as much as I hate the man, Woodrow Wilson and others, self-determination, irredentism, all of those things that people are really worried about. Things that are creeping up now, especially now that certain countries, certain nations are being pressed. If we're talking about the relationship between Indigenous peoples on this continent and other peoples on this continent and beyond, we're talking about the relationship between nations. And my concept of nationhood is like that of Benedict Anderson. It's exclusive, it's defined, it's usually limited in the ways that are defined by its own people. And outside of just the pure application of force and power, we've seen that with colonialism. That's the rule. Everything we've been doing since probably the 1700s has been the exception to the rule. And so imposing that sense of order and law harkens back to what some of our people were doing before contact. So I was just talking from the non-Indigenous side of my identity. Now think of all the things that we don't know about and how we related to one another before contact. The imposition of rules and order and philosophy behind how we relate to one another, not just on an individual basis, but on a family and clan and nation business matters. And it's not unprecedented in our communities. We know how this is done. We make treaties even though they may only be in the hearts and minds of people with much better memories than me. We have a history of treaties. We have a history of moving forward and doing things in a good way. The rest of the world is finally catching up to that. Now, if we're not willing to act unfairly in regards to one another, how do we make sure that that happens in regards to the application of how we relate to one another with the peoples of Canada, and the peoples within our own communities, and the peoples between each of those things? So I think the UN Declaration is a good expression of what it is we should be expecting with one another, between the Crown and Indigenous and First Nations and Inuit communities. But we need to start thinking in terms of, as treaty nations, using the power we already have to do good things. That we should not get held up on fixating solely on stopping the bad things from happening, especially from an external perspective. We need to build things, especially the things that have been knocked over. We need to apply the tools that we have already, the resources that we have already, to build something that's worth maintaining, worth protecting. Not just worry about getting more tools, although we should do that, but we need to use the tools we have in order to build up our capacities and our resilience. Because that specter of the application of power creeps up every once in a while. Imagine the conversations we were having before all of this stuff with Russia and Ukraine and the tariffs from the US, that has changed the conversation in regards to our rights and title when it comes to resource projects. When the BC Premier is saying we need to fast track a lot of these projects in order to survive moving forward, we need to understand that as Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders. We need to figure out what our questions and comments are going to be. I think balancing those collective considerations and what we need as our people, we need to balance that with an understanding of how people are thinking about it outside of our communities, because we may have to negotiate with people who have discomfort with the very concept of collective rights. And we'll have to sit across the table from them, or we'll get nothing done and we'll just hunker down for 4 years. How we use our treaties can protect what we have, but also the tools provided by our treaties can help us build something that will allow us to circumvent having to be subject to these forces outside of our control, specifically geopolitical and geoeconomic. Oh, it's the economy. You can't argue with the economy because we haven't built an alternative to how it is now. No one is even willing to have a discussion about defining enough so we all have enough to move forward as peoples. It's always about more, more, more. How can we get more? That fear of scarcity, that fear of uncertainty. We live in that scarcity. We survived in that scarcity and that uncertainty. We need to demonstrate a comfort with both of those things, because blindly running after certainty and more and more resources forever, it's going to make us no different, and we're just going to start playing the same power games over and over and over again. Now, that's all high level, but I had to say that. I don't even know how much time I have. But, how much time do I have? 12 minutes. Oh, 12 minutes. But with that in mind, when we talk about treaty-based activities, when we have a modern treaty, we're running into some of those difficulties. Not just with the public and the fear that, Indigenous communities and Indigenous governments have too much power and they're going to kill the economy and break Canada even more, and all of those things. Those are people worried about scarcity, uncertainty, and power, because they don't identify as being co-equal with us. They don't even identify as us mattering, because they're worried about them and theirs, however defined. Should we be doing the same? I don't know. And when we're talking about getting things done, when we're talking about all of the things we need to do at the ground level, we need to foster an understanding of how to interpret UNDRIP and how to make sure that our understanding is not only understood, but at least respected by the people across a table from us. And we have to really hit hit the ground on this because there are things that keep me up at night as Chief Counselor for my First Nation. And the things that keep me up are mostly about resources, because resources means we can do things to help our own people. I worry about revenue, and I worry about time and space. And the revenue conversation is we have to compete with not only our desire to catch up and keep up with the rest of Canada with whatever outcomes we're tracking, but we have to compete with inflation, we have to compete with our own growth rates, as well as all these other things that may impact our revenue streams or other things, pandemics. So what are the types of things that we can do to build wealth without having to rely on a government that may or may not actually care about giving us the resources we need to do what we need to do to become what we should have been? And for me, the only things we can do in response to that are to do two things. Further define for ourselves what our people need and what enough looks like for us to be content as a collective people. Then the other thing we need to do is how can we create more value in a globalized economy for as long as it will be globalized and share in that value. Because the current political and power structures are stated in that we're at a disadvantage unless we cooperate. I don't care whether or not you like cooperating, you're going to have to anyway. And as a result of that, we have to look at what we can do to create value and share in that value. Because we need to catch up and keep up. We need to keep up with our population rate. We need to keep up with inflation and guard ourselves from things like pandemics and geopolitical snafus. So, tall order. We're all responsible for that. We're all doing everything we can in order to do that. How do we use the tools we have to build something that's worth protecting and build something in partnership with those we have good relationships with and foster good relationships with to build that value and share in that value? And how do we further use our pre-contact wisdom in defining what it is we should desire in order to be happy and content as a people and as individuals, understanding that individuals won't always agree on what that looks like. Because for me, camping is a hotel room with only one bathroom. But the real consideration here is when we take approaches that are holistic in nature, we run into difficulties when it comes to addressing those impacts of colonization because we have disagreements on the terms and disagreements on how we're going to evaluate our progress. Now, we've been able to ensure that future governments will interpret our treaties as being positivistic. You must understand that your laws must be compatible with our treaties because the UN Declaration asks you to bring your laws into compatibility with the Declaration and with our treaties. But that only goes part of the way. And so it's hard to integrate those things into existing programs unless we have those core conversations with real decision makers. And that's where that conversation around negotiation and understanding how we're going to solve disputes is going to matter. Because I don't think even Canada, under the most multilateralist prime minister, is going to submit to decisions made by a UN body. We have to negotiate. That's why we negotiated. Because despite how long it took to negotiate the Monmouth Treaty, it was definitely faster and I think less costly and more goodwill creating by negotiating with whoever was in front of us. And at the time, that was a Stephen Harper federal government and a Gordon Campbell premiership in BC. We can do these things and we can create partnerships moving forward, but I think part of it isn't always fixating on holding the line, but rather determining how we build up what's behind that line so that there's a degree of defense in depth, resilience, that there's more of our world to help create resilience and solidity in who we are as a people and who we are individually as members of those governments. I think I think we're shifting in regards to what matters to us moving forward, and how we use the declaration is going to matter the most in our conversations with non-treaty First Nations, so that we're not set up in opposition to their interests, and that we have to navigate that as if they are our equals, because they are, and vice versa. And I feel like I can get into more, but it'll just take me down a 10-minute path. So I think I'm going to stop here. So thanks, Brent.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to our panelists. In the time that we have remaining in this session, I'd like to pose a couple of questions to you, and starting off with Dr. Lightfoot. What can we learn from the international context? Here, this group in this room, working at implementing modern treaties, been at it, some of them, for 50 years. What can we learn from UNDRIP in the international context?
Big question, Brent. The world is a big place, and there are nations who have similar histories to Canada, similar legal frameworks, and most of them who are very, very different. So I think when we look to other countries for similar examples or lessons, the primary places to look often are New Zealand and Australia. And neither one of them are an exact analogous fit. They also have significant differences. So in New Zealand, of course, we have the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a single treaty signed with a number of Maori chiefs and iwis, with, at the time, the Crown, the British Crown. And that treaty was signed in 1840, so single treaty over the entire 2 islands of New Zealand. And at the time, there were 2 language versions of that treaty. One was in Te Reo Maori, and under that version, Maori retained a significant degree of sovereignty and rights over land and resources. Unfortunately, there was an English version of the treaty at the same time with a very different translation, which said that land and sovereignty were ceded to the Queen at the time. So that conflict, that discrepancy, gave the Crown a lot of latitude to exert some serious colonial power relations. They took land without compensation, they took resources, and they very much overextended the colonial experience in New Zealand. So out of this level of discrepancies and conflicts and land loss and culture loss and all the things we're familiar with, came eventually, again, always with the result of Indigenous advocacy, states never give these things or grant them, came a set of new laws and processes. And one of them that we should pay attention to in New Zealand is the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal. That is a dispute mechanism that in many cases is the first step towards a treaty settlement, but it's not required. However, a lot of claimant groups like to go there first because it gives the opportunity for the entire history of the experience and the treaty dispute to be aired. It's very cathartic for communities oftentimes. It can be, at the same time, very painful, so some caution is definitely warranted in this space. But by and large, the tribunal gets high reviews both from the state side and the Maori side as a forum to really articulate what all has happened, which then can lead to a very comprehensive treaty settlement. And when we do treaty settlements in New Zealand, they look quite similar to land claims in this country or the BC treaty process that we're all quite familiar with. The tribunal, in and of itself, only provides recommendations, however. It's not a binding legal mechanism. And unfortunately, a lot depends on the political will of the Parliament at the time on whether those recommendations are actioned or not. But at least there's a record, and there's an opportunity to pick it up later. A less great example is Australia. There have been many attempts to get a national level treaty in Australia because Australia, unlike New Zealand, was settled without any original treaties in the 1700s, 1800s, so on. So there have been multiple attempts over the years to get a national treaty. At the moment, that has no political legs whatsoever. I don't know when, if ever, it will again. However, there's some good news at state level. There have been a number of states and territories that have been working towards some kind of treaty at that level. Again, political will of the day dictates a lot of things, so the only really viable one at the moment is in the state of Victoria, which is the small southeast corner of Australia where the city of Melbourne is located. They have had good days and bad days. They have assembly, a state-level assembly, so they are working together. Those are elected representatives from the Indigenous people that go to the state-level assembly, and they are actively working on negotiating a treaty framework. But now the challenge there, if you can imagine, what if you had to have a single treaty for the Yukon or a single treaty for British Columbia? You can well imagine the complexities and the problems and the challenges that come with that. So it's a space to watch, but they, in that case, are looking, in the state of Victoria, looking very strongly to the Canadian model. And there's lots of conversation back and forth about the learnings. Now, if we look globally, and just give me 90 seconds more on globally, there are a number of places to bring conversations, disputes about treaty. The Inter-American system, human rights system, and the Court of Human Rights and the Inter-American system has been very strong on recognizing treaties and advancing treaties. So if one wanted to take something internationally, that is a very viable place to look. And again, like I mentioned in my early comments, there's been very little work so far on international mechanisms or bodies to arbitrate treaty conflicts or treaty disputes. So that is certainly something to keep advocating for, not only for modern treaty construction, but for all our brothers and sisters that hold other kinds of treaties. I think it's important to keep pushing for that as a global Indigenous community. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. John, one of the big topics in this context is FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. Now, I know, Huu-ay-aht, modern treaty nation, treaty lands, also has interests in adjacent crown lands within Huu-ay-aht, Hahuthli. And Huu-ay-aht also has very active forestry operations. We also know that the Ministry of Forests, when permits are being applied for on Crown land, that Huu-ay-aht has an overlap with a neighboring nation, the government deals with both nations. In that context, with FPIC, if Huu-ay-aht's interests conflict with a neighboring non-modern treaty nation interests, what role do you see FPIC playing? Like, does that become a veto? Does that interfere with Huu-ay-aht interests? How do you see navigating FPIC?
I think the concepts of free, prior, and informed consent aren't entirely, okay, how should I say this? I think the Huu-ay-aht and Nuu-chah-nulth approach to free, prior, and informed consent potentially gives us more insight into how we should go about managing the interests and relationships between nations within a given area. So we have a concept of Hishuk Masawak, which is everything is connected. It's the idea that all things are interconnected, interdependent, and have reciprocal relationships, and beyond. It's more than that, but that's how I understand it. We also have the concept of Izak, which is greater respect, which is, at least in terms of politics, publicly demonstrating respectful relationship building and agreements between groups, in this instance maybe two nations, by the light of the big house fire, or the light of day. And if we ever get to a point where it becomes a veto, I've failed in my job if I was a proponent. That in order to think of Hawaiian forestry resources, we have to think about it not just in terms of what we want, but what are our responsibilities to the land, as well as our neighbors who are often co-stewards of the land, depending on where it is and how it exists. And therefore, it's my job as a leader to help manage the relationship in a way where nothing is a surprise, and that we have cultivated enough trust and understanding that we've already talked about this and they're not surprised by what we're trying to do. In regards to how it works with forestry, it becomes, how do I relate to leaders from Tishot or other nations in navigating not only our own cultural and political expectations, but also the expectations and frameworks presented by the governments of BC and Canada. And that's demonstrative of the ideas that other entities should be taking in their approach, in that, what is your relationship with those who have the responsibility as the stewards of their own land and peoples? That there's no real difference between what I'm doing and what other leaders are doing in the rest of BC and Canada, other than the fact that I think we are more open to creating relationship-based aspects of consideration. But that's already part of the leadership best practices, and you can really see when some leaders in the business world or the political world are just pure interest, pure self-interest and positional, and that's when it becomes difficult. In this new era, relationship building is a core component of creating value in this economy and sharing in it. And that's one of the core principles of how Hawaiian moves forward. We demonstrate our understanding of the interests of those around us and try to suggest things that are mutually acceptable to all involved. That we create value by creating good, productive relationships that take others into consideration as well as our own. And that's not fun, but it's important. And I think that's one thing that we need to demonstrate further over time, in that even if we're not successful, that we've tried in doing these things over time, iteratively, culturally, as a part of the understanding between cultures or between nations, they will start to understand that we're doing it this way for a purpose, that you can trust that we're trying, and that you can trust us. Because it goes both ways, especially when you have conversations with people who are more concerned about scarcity and uncertainty. They're way more emotionally driven than they are driven by logic. And so you have to address those emotions more than anything. And that's relationship building. That's not just interests and positions. Thanks.
Thank you, John. And I saved, Gary, you for the last, and I'm going to spring this one on you. You've been involved in Canada's journey of reconciliation now since the mid-70s, I think it is. And you've seen a lot of change. So if I ask you to look into the crystal ball, where do you see us going? As a country, as Indigenous people in this room, what do you see in the future?
In 3 words or less?
I could go with 3 minutes or less.
Well, first of all, before we go on to that, I just want to reiterate what I've said now for the last many years, which is just my total admiration for John Jack as a leader and as a human being. He never ceases to amaze me in terms of his wisdom. I knew John when he was fresh out of university, and his beard was actually black at that time. So I talked about change, but it's John's reference to leadership, I think, is so relevant to this conversation. It is going to take wise, sacrificing leaders with an understanding of humanity and human relations to steer through some of this stuff. So back to your question, Brent, I started in the mid 70s, was legal counsel to Inuit Tiperis out of Canada. And it was the world I functioned in at that time was about 180 degrees different from what it is now. So there was the only legal foundation we had to proceed on at that time was the Calder decision out of BC, the James Bay Agreement out of Quebec, no modern treaties. So there was we weren't standing on a solid legal foundation, beating the table with some confidence that we could cajole governments into acknowledging inherent rights of Indigenous people. I guess that in answer to your question, there are a number of factors that have brought us to where we are now. Certainly Calder, James Bay Agreement were instrumental. Probably the most critical factor was Pierre Trudeau's desire to decolonize the relationship between the nation state of Canada and Britain. So he wanted to patriate the Constitution. As it turned out, he couldn't garner the support he needed without Indigenous people. Thus, we had a 2-year conversation from 80 to 82 about where Indigenous people fit into the new constitutional arrangement of Canada. And that produced Section 35. It also produced what's now Section 25. And it laid the foundation. There was no going back. And as I said earlier, the commitment as of 1982 was that Indigenous people had a unique identity in law and in politics in this country that was protected by the Constitution, that was beyond the range of federal and provincial legislation. And it was a commitment, without stating so, to decolonize. The problem was nobody knew what that meant. It was just an aspiration. And so we spent 4 First Ministers conferences in the 80s trying to put meat on that bone. And we were not successful for a whole lot of reasons that are worthy of many a dissertation. But at the end of the day, it failed. Mulroney came back and tried to get Meech Lake. Elijah Harper terminated that initiative. Then they came back and tried to do the Charlottetown Accord, all with the intent of saying, where do Indigenous people fit in the Constitution of this country? And Charlottetown Accord failed. We subsequently had the Kelowna Accord that Harper sued, and in between we had a series of court cases that started to actually put meat on the bone. So Delgamuukw, the Campbell case, other cases that started to say what Aboriginal rights and title meant in law and articulate the details of a decolonized relationship. We've now progressed to the point where federal and provincial policies both acknowledge that need to decolonize, acknowledge their legal obligations to consult and accommodate, acknowledge the basis of the honor of the Crown, and invest the Canadian psyche in demanding that the Crown live honorably, act honorably. And the concepts have taken hold in ways that now extend beyond the Crown to third party. So we've got corporate entities that now want to negotiate with First Nations on the basis of acknowledging First Nation rights. So the conversation's different. The parameters are set in the conversations about what it's about. If it's about rights, what do the rights look like? It's about rights to land, what kind of rights to land exist? If it's about resources, what types of resources and what's the value of the resources? If it's about power, as John alluded to earlier, it's a question of how you define the power. What's the extent of that power vis-a-vis specific jurisdictions, land, child welfare, you name it, resources. So that's a long-winded answer to your question of how is it different? It's different in all of those ways because this conversation is different. And First Nations are coming to the conversations as partners, empowered to speak about what their objectives are. And now I'll shut up.
Thank you, Gary. And thank you, everyone. Thanks to our panelists for your participation, to the audience for listening patiently, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.